안녕하세요. 오늘 서울대에서 East Slavic에 대한 첫 강의를 하게 되어 참 기쁘게 생각합니다. 한국 여행은 저에게 이번이 처음입니다. 그렇지만 저는 이미 이 도시와 여러분이 할 기회에 아주 큰 상을 받았습니다. Now, I don't want you to think that I really speak Korean. So I will also say that I am delighted to be here, and I have many memories of Korea from long ago, when I was still a young boy, when the United States became involved in the Korean War, of course. And I also have very pleasant memories of Korean students coming to the United States to study. First at UCLA, where I had the pleasure of teaching your wonderful professor, Yoonji Song, and also Professor Sung-ho Choi, whom I think I will see on Friday, I hope, yes. And at Harvard, Hak Young-song and Kwon-jun Kwon, who are currently students there. They have made and will continue to make important contributions to Slavic linguistics. I'm grateful to accept your kind invitation to come to Seoul to present the results of my research. And the first one will be today on a cultural topic. And then on Friday, I will speak on two linguistic topics, both of them connected with Slavic, but the second one more with a general linguistic frame of reference. So I think without further ado, if we could turn the lights down, everyone will be able to see. Can you all understand me? Am I speaking slowly enough? Yeah? Okay. Too slow. All right, I'll speed it up a little. All right. So first of all, I want to point out that this man, of course, is Ivan the Terrible, that you've probably heard about. Well, my talk today is concerned with the function of space, time, and timelessness in the presentation at court of the first Tsar of Muscovite Rus, Ivan IV, also known as the Terrible, or in more contemporary parlance, the Awesome. Although the royal throne room, the Golden Hall, Zolotaya Palata, has been discussed from several different perspectives over the past 80 years, I hope to show that a significant dimension of the Muscovite worldview manifested in this center of the realm, center of his kingdom, the apocalyptic domain of Orthodox eschatology, has been understated or even ignored. Yet it's precisely that dimension, the eschatological dimension, that gives Muscovy's imperial claims a resonance beyond everyday goals of territorial security and economic expansion. Matters of the here and now must not divert our attention from Moscow's greater destiny. Consider, for example, Clifford Geertz's views on the symbolic significance of the political center of a complexly organized society. Clifford Geertz, a quite famous social anthropologist at Princeton. He says, there is both a governing elite and a set of symbolic forms expressing the fact that it is in truth governing. No matter how democratically the members of the elite are chosen, usually not very, or how deeply divided among themselves they may be, usually much more than outsiders imagine, they justify their existence and order their actions in terms of a collection of stories, ceremonies, insignias, formalities, and appurtenances that they have either inherited or, in more revolutionary situations, invented. It is these crowns and coronations that mark the center as center and give what goes on there its aura of being not merely important, but in some odd fashion connected with the way the world is built. The gravity of high politics and the solemnity of high worship spring from liker impulses than might first appear. Now, if we go to look at what the center of Muscovy is like, I hope that you all recognize this scene, the Moscow Kremlin today. And the area that we're going to be talking about, you can tell that because we have buses out here. This is not Ivan the Terrible's Kremlin. The area that we're going to be talking about is this old area right here with the major cathedrals in it and the square around which they are clustered. It's called Cathedral Square. Fortunately, we actually have a much older map, but I wanted to orient you to where we are. So for those of you who know Moscow, let me go back. This is the Moscow River here. Here is Red Square. Here's the Lenin Mausoleum. Here is St. Basil's Cathedral. Okay, let's go now to a much older map of Moscow, beginning of the 1600s. And you can see, we can recognize the familiar landmarks. Here's the Moscow River. Here's Red Square. Here is St. Basil's Cathedral. You enter through the Savior Gates up to this area right here. That's where we're going to be concentrating our efforts in Cathedral Square. That was the political and spiritual center of Muscovite Rus in the mid-16th century, in the Kremlin. And some of the grandest public ceremonies involving the heads of church and state identified its hierarchical superiority as a place. And if we take a close-up view, and here you can see the square right in here, which is what we're talking about, there are specific churches that we will want to point out as being especially important. So first of all, the Cathedral of the Dormition, which is located at the end of the arrow, and that is what it looks like on the right today, built by an Italian, Aristotele Fioravanti. This is the main cathedral church of Moscow. Then the Cathedral of the Annunciation, which is located, again, at the head of the arrow. This is the Palace Church. And finally, the church, the Cathedral of Archangel Michael, which is just opposite the Annunciation. And this is the Necropolis. This is the church where all of the grand princes and tsars of Muscovy were buried. In a non-public sphere, hierarchy was determined by function and by accessibility. An official audience with the Tsar was a rare privilege, accorded to members of the court elite and selected foreigners. The symbolic presentation of the Tsar defined his social, political, and spiritual function, and metonymically determined the physical center of power and authority in Muscovy. So to enter the throne room of the Golden Hall was to encounter the emperor of the free Orthodox world at that time. All the others were subjugated by other nations. That throne room was saturated with imagery combining representations of Christian doctrine with depictions of non-Christian historical events, military prowess, rulership, and all kinds of phenomena of nature, all guided by God's divine wisdom, Premudrost Bozhya. Whatever concrete roles the Tsar may have performed in the course of everyday life, his larger function in the Orthodox Muscovite conception of how the world is built is sought in no better place than the very throne room in which he was presented. This was a room designed to display him to his subjects and to the world. In this confined space, organized in accordance with the vision of the ruler and his intimate circle, oppositions of high and low, of near and far, all take on a special, important significance that we have to try to understand. So, in this kind of space, time is imagined within history in terms of motion. What is fixed, what has always been, is, of course, timeless and ahistorical. The notion of time is neatly captured in one of two metaphors so well articulated by Stephen Jay Gould. Time's arrow, which is history as a directional, irreversible sequence of events, and time's cycle, history as a non-directional repetition of cycles that come over and over and over again. The linearity of time's arrow defines distinct boundaries that we can call beginning and end. whereas the circularity of time's cycle brooks no favor with beginning or ending, preferring to see them as two perspectives of one and the same boundary. What's interesting about Cathedral Square here, and here you can see again this is a 17th century representation of the coronation of the first Romanov Tsar, and you can see all of the churches that we've been talking about, the Dormition here, the Annunciation here, the Archangel here, and the throne room is in the Zolotaya Palata, the Golden Hall, which is located here at the head of the staircase leading up from Cathedral Square. Here you see all the courtiers assembled in Cathedral Square, and this is right at the moment where the Tsar has appeared outside the Dormition after his coronation, and he's being showered with coins, with gold coins. Now what's interesting is when we take a look at the Slavic root kon, ken, and kun, we see that one and the same root can mean end or beginning. So kon as in kanyets, kon as in iskani, from time immemorial, kon as in pakon, meaning custom, or zakon, meaning law or order, and nachala, from nachanlo, originally from nakunlo. So for the Slavs, the whole notion of boundary and beginning and end, you see, come together. They are really one and the same boundary and simply looked at from two different perspectives. And we have to keep that in mind, that the circular notion of time is extremely important for them. Now, the acceptance of Christianity brought with it an overriding sense of linear time from creation to the apocalypse, combined with cyclical time. Old Testament as a prefiguration of New Testament. When we read the New Testament, we see all kinds of references to the Old Testament. This is what was predicted in the Old Testament. This is what is coming true in the New Testament. This whole notion of cycle again and again. Beyond history, that is beyond time, Christianity promised the reunification of the faithful with God through deification in the New Jerusalem following the apocalypse and the Last Judgment, when historical distinctions like night and day, heat and cold, heaven and earth were rendered invalid, no longer important. So with time and space thus considered, let's turn to the Golden Hall and our task of understanding the complex program of images produced at the beginning of Ivan's reign. By any stretch of the imagination, the winter and spring of 1547 were momentous for Muscovite Rus and its primary political and spiritual leaders. On January 16th, 1547, the court gathered in Cathedral Square at the Cathedral of the Dormition to watch Metropolitan Makary anoint the 16-year-old Grand Prince Ivan as the first officially crowned and reigning Tsar of all Rus, Ivan IV. February 3rd, the same principals gathered in the Cathedral of the Annunciation for the Tsar's marriage to Anastasia Romanova. Then, following several fires that spring, a major fire broke out on June 21st in the Arbat. Those of you who've been to Moscow know where the Arbat is, very close to the Kremlin. And the Chronicle describes the fire as racing like lightning all the way to the Kremlin and ultimately to Cathedral Square. Would say not an auspicious beginning to start a reign. This is what Cathedral Square looks like. I think we're getting more used to the buildings. Let me point out again, in the midst of Cathedral Square, here is the Golden Hall, throne room. Here's the Dormition Cathedral. Here's the Archangel Cathedral, and here is the Annunciation. Among the casualties of the firestorm was the Kremlin's Golden Hall throne room and vestibule. The young Tsar ordered that all of the court buildings destroyed in the fire be rebuilt. Now, planned under Ivan III, the young Tsar's grandfather, here we have a nice chronology so you can follow a little what we're talking about. The Golden Hall was completed by Ivan III's son, Vasily III, young Ivan's father, in 1508, and apparently decorated and gilded shortly thereafter. Nonetheless, the name Zolotaya Palata, Golden Hall, first recorded in the Tsarstvenaya Kniga in 1514, was surely inspired by its counterpart in Constantinople, the Chrysotriklinos, the Golden Hall. Whatever decoration existed before 1547 was apparently destroyed in the fire. So icon painters from Novgorod and from Pskov were brought to Moscow immediately, some to produce new icons, some to restore frescoes, including the murals on the walls of the Golden Hall. The resulting decoration, completed between 1547 and 1553, was apparently innovative and very controversial. A total conflagration, a total fire which destroys everything, of course, presents unique decorating opportunities. Olga Podobyadova and David Miller have both emphasized that the time of Ivan IV saw the beginnings of a crisis in the medieval Russian worldview. This shift is expressed artistically through the development of non-traditional themes, the use of unorthodox imagery, and allegorical iconography, a clearer sense of history and the movement of time. A baptism of fire, as it were, in the very beginning of the reign of the first Muscovite Tsar, offered Ivan and his close advisors and mentors the opportunity to set Muscovy right, to express in their own sense of how the world must be built and what Muscovy's place in it must be. The convocation of councils to write a new code of laws, the Sudzhykye, in 1550 took place. And that created stricter regulation for church government. That was in 1551, as you see on the chronology. The Stoglov Council meeting then is part of this greater commitment to tighten up the rules of the church. And the introduction of an innovative iconographic program into the political center of Muscovite power in 1547 is just another part of this general idea of reform and making Moscow into the image that they all thought it should have. The beginning of Ivan's reign was to be understood as the dawning of a new age. The novelty of the Golden Hall frescoes was soon noted and actually challenged during the so-called Viskovati affair in 1553. The proceedings of the trial, we have actually records of that. They don't give us very many clues, but there are nonetheless some tantalizing contemporary descriptions of the mural composition. So protesting the rational rather than scriptural basis of the imagery, for example, this monk Viskovati protested against the depiction of a coarse, slovenly woman painted near the image of Christ Savior. And it reads as follows. В палаце в средней государя нашего написан образ Спасов, да тутож, близко него, написана жонка, спустя рукава кабы пляшет, а подписано над нею блужение. In the central hall of our sovereign, the Savior's image is painted, and a coarse woman is painted there, near it, in a slovenly pose, as if dancing, and fornication is inscribed above her. Viskovati was forced to recant and recognize the Church's official apologia for the images in Greek and Russian precedent. Now, we already know fire was no stranger to the Golden Hall. It apparently struck again. Let's go back to our chronology. Oh, yeah, let's point her out. Yeah, there she is. There's the dancer that he was talking about, right next to. Now, going back to the chronology, we see that there was again a fire in 1569. There was another one in 1571. And there's no written evidence of redecoration. So apparently those fires didn't seem to have a huge effect on the inside of the Golden Hall. But a century later, in 1672, Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich had the icon painter Simon Ushakov and an assistant write a detailed description of the Golden Hall murals prior to their being repainted in tempera. 80 years later, in 1752, the Golden Hall was pulled down along with adjacent palace buildings to make way for Empress Elizabeth's Kremlin Palace. This is the daughter of Peter I. So although differing in certain details, the 16th and 17th century mural programs seem to be very close, an impression that leads most investigators to see in the description that was made by Ushakov the very ideas of what Ivan's people did to decorate the Golden Hall. And here once again is the palace complex. Remember, this is the Golden Hall up here. Now, although very rich in detail, the thematic composition of the Golden Hall is fairly straightforward. And here you can use your handout. Here is a schematic showing the Golden Hall where it's located. So here we're looking down into Cathedral Square again, right here. Here's the Annunciation Church. Here's the Golden Hall up at the head of the staircase. And now you see how we're oriented, but we're going to have to reorient ourselves. So now if we take, there's the Golden Hall. So now if we take a picture of the Golden Hall, and in order to get it right, to agree with what you're doing so we can look at things right side up, we're just going to flip it around. And you see that the throne is where the big red square is. That's where the throne is situated, and we're going to want to keep that in mind. Now from the handout, you can see that the vestibule in the throne room divide fairly neatly into 3 vertical zones or registers. First of all, what we see on the ceiling in those circles and the adjacent parts of the ceiling. Then a little bit lower, you see divided into semicircles the vaults, of course, that are holding the roof up. And then finally, what is painted on the walls. 3 separate zones. The dome surmounting each room is devoted to iconography expressing the divine wisdom of the Lord, especially rendering from Proverbs 9, 1 and 2, which reads, "Wisdom hath builded her house, she hath hewn out her 7 pillars, she hath killed her beasts, she hath mingled her wine, she hath also furnished her table." Remember, wisdom is going to play an important part in what we're going to talk about. The cupola of the vestibule, so that's the entry room, contains a rendering of the Trinity icon called Fatherhood, surrounded by 7 scenes based on verses from the book of Proverbs. So here we have this rendition of fatherhood, and then each of these 7 scenes that encircle it, all representing sayings from the book of Proverbs, and all devoted to the theme of the righteous ruler. A ruler has to be good, he has to rule in a righteous way. The cupola of the throne room, and here's the throne room, contains the Ancient of Days, or God Sabaoth, surrounded by cherubim and juxtaposed to a rich assortment of personifications of heavenly bodies. We see all kinds of things around here. Heavenly bodies represented, or the seasons of the year, the elements, virtues and vices. Right here, here's that famous dancer that we were looking at earlier. She represents fornication. All of that is here. And in Viscovati's 16th century account, the inscription right around that image reads, "Primudrost Iisus Christos," which is really wisdom, Jesus Christ. Whereas in Ushakov's rendering, it's Iisus Christos Immanuel. But wisdom is mentioned, which literally means God is with us. Wisdom is mentioned throughout the trial, so I think there's no question that wisdom was still an important image, even in the 16th century. The 17th century description also notes that Christ Emmanuel sits on a rainbow. Let's look back at that again. Sitting on a rainbow, and wears a crown with 7 points, which is not depicted at all. The person who reconstructed this did not follow Ushakov's description, but in the description, he wears a crown with 7 points, sedem klinov. He holds a golden chalice, potir zlat. Here again, he made a mistake. This is not a golden chalice. He has him holding an orb, but it should be a chalice, something that holds wine. And a scepter or rod, a palitsa, in his right hand. That's correct. He does have him doing that. And many-eyed wheels beneath his feet. And you see that down here. Described along with prefigurations of the 4 evangelists. Of course, this image is well known to those who are devout Christians. This is from the vision of Ezekiel. As I hope to show later, this particular image of Christ is a direct expression of a dominant theme of the throne room decorations. The pendentives of the vestibule depict Old Testament kings of the house of David. The pendentives are these parts right here, these triangular parts that ride up to the edge of the circle. And these are Old Testament kings here. Whereas the pendentives in the throne room actually depict Russian and great Russian princes. The vaults of the vestibule are devoted to narrative scenes from the life of Moses, while the walls depict many of the famous military battles of Joshua. The vaults of the throne room are much more diverse. We have illustrations of New Testament parables, a narrative of Gideon's victory over the Midianites, a scene from the tale of Balaam and Josaphat, and the walls illustrate major events in the lives of Saint Volodymyr, who baptized Rus, and Volodymyr Monomach, who provides a link to the Byzantine royal line. In both rooms, each image in the ceiling is supplemented with long scriptural or historical citations. What are we supposed to make of this profusion of images? The surprisingly small number of scholars who have worked on this have reached a rough consensus on its significance. It is primarily ideological and moralizing, that is, intended to persuade a young Tsar to do the right thing, to be righteous, to be just, to be merciful, and ideological, to promote the political and spiritual authority of Muscovite Rus in human history. Daniel Rowland from the University of Kentucky elaborates on Podobyadova's analysis of the use of vertical space in the Golden Hall. He notes the possibility of taking the Middle Byzantine system of church decoration and projecting it onto the Golden Hall and vestibule. So he defines three zones. The upper zone he defines as theological. The middle is the didactic, moralizing zone, the one that refers to Moses. And the lower one is the historical zone. He observes certain correspondences as well between the placement of images in the vestibule and the throne room. No one is going to argue about the inspiration of Orthodox church decoration on the decoration of the Golden Hall. But I conceive this connection in broader structural terms, arguing not only that vertical space has clear-cut functions, but horizontal space as well. A distinctly organized directionality, what David Miller has termed an obsession for temporal returns. Remember I talked about time's arrow. Brings the flow of time directly into the space of the living Tsar, into the presentational space of him and the Ancient of Days. When? At the end of time. It is the apocalyptic dimension expressed in this juxtaposition of specific symbols and images in space that all investigators, including Rowland, have either ignored or underappreciated. And yet that is what resolves the tension that we see in this temporal motion. Now, if the Golden Hall decoration is examined from the perspective of theme, chronology, and teleology, that is the goal that it's moving towards, then a structural principle emerges, a set of vectors, different in both rooms, that carry the observer from the unidirectional room of preparation, the vestibule, to the multi-directional room of encounter, the throne room. This is a phenomenon that has been overlooked in the literature, but once recognized must play a role in the interpretation of this political center of Muscovite Rus. Vestibule can be opposed semiotically to the throne room as unmarked to marked. The meaning of the former is defined by its relation to the latter. In the vestibule, this is where all the courtiers and other dignitaries waited to gain entrance into the throne room. The wisdom of the Lord manifested itself through the agency of the righteous ruler, as represented in the 7 scenes surrounding the Trinity. As for the vaults, through the authority granted him by God, Moses has succeeded in preparing his people, the chosen people, to enter into the promised land. Moses chooses Joshua to succeed him. He says, "And Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands upon him, and the children of Israel hearkened unto him, and did as the Lord commanded Moses." It is the military prowess of Joshua, much appreciated by the courtiers in waiting, because most of them were the court on horseback, that actually delivers the Israelites to the promised land. Thematically and chronologically, the deliverance below anticipates the rule of David and his house in Jerusalem, the city of David, and leads us to the 6 Old Testament kings depicted in the pendentives above. If we look at the schematic chart that I've made for what we've been looking at, here is the icon of the fatherhood. Here are the 7 scenes from the Proverbs, and here are the 6 Old Testament kings. And notice that we start with David, and of course, if we think about the chronology, David is followed by Solomon, Solomon is followed by Rehoboam, Rehoboam is followed by Abijah, Abijah by Asa, and Asa by Jehoshaphat. So in other words, we have the chronology of this as well. So it's not simply 6 Old Testament kings. It is specifically the house of David, the beginning of the house of David, which, as the Bible of Matthew reminds us, leads through 14 generations to the Babylonian captivity, and then through 14 more generations to Jesus Christ, the telos of this long directed line that began with Abraham. Now, medallion busts painted under the arches of the windows continue the line from Jehoshaphat, with some interesting omissions. See, that's what's interesting when you look at something semiotically and you're expecting a certain logic, and all of a sudden something's omitted. You have to say, why? That's not an accident. Why did they omit something? So, what did they put as the next Old Testament king after Jehoshaphat? Not his son, Jehoram, but his grandson, King Ahaziah, is depicted above the northeast window. Why? Well, Jehoram, it turns out, was an evil king who began his reign by slaying all of his brothers and sisters. He violated God's commandments, and he ultimately received a letter from the prophet Elijah that condemned his people and predicted the horrible disease of the bowels, from which he actually died 2 years later. All images that could not have been very popular in the throne room of Ivan the Terrible. So no reason to put that Old Testament king up on the ceiling. King Jehoash, the next in line, is depicted above the southeast window. Three kings, Amaziah, Azariah, and Jotham, are bypassed in favor of King Ahaz, depicted above the western window. This appears to be a very strange choice, since Ahaz closed down the temple in Jerusalem, sponsored pagan cults, participated in child sacrifice, and presided over Judah's decline into a mere satellite of Assyria. Why would any Tsar of Muscovy want an icon of Ahaz on his wall? The answer may lie in the symbolism of Ahaz's son, King Hezekiah, who cleaned out and reconsecrated the temple at Jerusalem, reinstated the pilgrimage to the capital at Passover, withstood an Assyrian siege, and by means of conduit brought water into Jerusalem. The non-righteous Ahaz anticipates the righteous Hezekiah. And Hezekiah is depicted in the throne room. So you have the non-righteous ruler in the vestibule referring to the righteous ruler in the throne room. But even more important is the fact that King Ahaz alone, of all the kings of Judah, was told by God that as a sign of the Lord's authority and a guarantee of the dynasty's future, a virgin would conceive and bear a son and would call his name Emmanuel, from Isaiah 7, verse 14. The vestibule, as befits its function, is a room of prefiguration, expectation, preparation. In line with this telic function, the directional flow of narrative on the walls and in the vaults moves in what Marilyn Lavin has recently identified as an apse pattern down. You start at the top and you move down from left to right. So if you look at your scheme, you'll see that the narratives of Moses and Joshua that I've labeled M and J both begin at the northeastern corner by the entrance. You see where the entrance is up here at the top. They both begin here, and they go around in a clockwise fashion. So we have images from M1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way around to M10, and then the Joshua images move in the same way. So the directionality in the room of preparation is exactly the same, this clockwise movement. Above, Moses receives his authority from God, leads the Israelites out of bondage, and through God's help performs a number of miracles to keep them alive. This is all M1 through M7. And then in the last frames of the vaults, M8 through 10, the Israelites are victorious in the battle over the Midianites. The introduction of a military theme leads the viewer to ground level, now to Joshua, where we see J 1 through 10. Joshua defeats city after city after city, smites the rulers, takes possession of the spoils, and most important, takes possession of the land. In sum, the entire function of the room is preparatory, one in which the virtues of the good ruler, the determination of a faithful people, military might, and a strong directionality of time's arrow lead to the expectation of salvation. It is God the Father, or the Ancient of Days, existing before all time, who is emphasized here, and he is depicted overseeing several of the events on the vestibule walls and vaults. And it's these types of relationships that are established in the vestibule that lead the observer towards certain expectations in the throne room. But patterns of congruence and divergence will play different roles here, for the simple, highly significant reason that the images in the throne room not only interact with each other, but with the living Tsar. The placement of the throne sets up a tension with every part of the throne room. Therefore, the hierarchical value of an image will be determined not only by its place in vertical space, but also by its place in horizontal space, how it relates to the throne. Now, like the throne in the faceted hall, the Monomach throne in the Cathedral of Dormition, the Tsar's throne is placed in the southeast corner, the eastern wall, clearly considered the most sacred and important. And let's just take a quick look around the vestibule before we enter the throne room. This is the vestibule showing each of the walls. These are the battles of Joshua, east, south, west, and north. We can look at them a little bit more in detail. You can see the way these depictions work, but they're all dealing with battles of attacking cities and defeating them, one after another. And you can see these images of God Sabaoth overlooking many of them as we move around. In the east, in the south, you can see more clearly how the Old Testament kings fit in here. This being here are these parts from Proverbs. More battles, and yet more battles. Now we move into the throne room. Let's look at the inscriptions there, because that always gives us an interesting idea of what the meanings might be. Two inscriptions surround the Christ Emmanuel that will give us a clue as to what's going on. The first is, Бог Отец премудростью своею основа землю и утверди веки. God the Father, through his wisdom, founded the earth and fixed the ages. That's this very first inscription around here. Then the second inscription, Благослови венец лету благости Твоя, Господи. Crown the year with thy beneficence, O Lord. In a circle surrounding these inscriptions is a third, the longest. Привечное слово Отче, иже во образе Божий сы, и составляй тварь от небытия в бытие, иже времена и лето своею областью положей, благослови венец лету благостью своею. Даруй мир церквам Твоим, победой верному царю, благоплодие земли и нам велью милость. O Logos of the Father beyond eternity, who exists in God's image and who brings creation into being from non-being, who by his authority has set the seasons and the years, crown the year with thy beneficence, grant peace to thy churches, victories to the true emperor, fertility to the land, and great mercy to us. Frank Kempfer, a German Slavist, has linked the second and third inscriptions to the liturgical office of the ecclesiastical new year, which in the Orthodox Church is September 1st. The first inscription has not been traced to a specific text and may simply be a descriptive statement reflecting several biblical verses with analogous sentiments. Inexplicably, no one analyzing the Golden Hall murals has examined the New Year service in greater detail, and yet its importance in the ritual life of the court and the set of prescribed readings assigned to it reveal a great deal. Now we have here a rendition of what a procession must have looked like in Cathedral Square. This in the early 17th century, but it would have looked very much like this in the 16th century. Here is the Cathedral Church of the Dormition. Here is the Ivan the Great bell tower. We can see a very elaborate procession with icons and churchmen here walking past, processing by. On the morning of September 1st, the Metropolitan, later the Patriarch, of Moscow, followed by 2 deacons, each bearing the Gospels, exited the western doors of the Cathedral of the Dormition, that's this cathedral church. The rest of the clergy, with icons and ecclesiastical accoutrements, stood waiting in front of the entrance. The Metropolitan stopped, turned back to face the church to the east, and stood while an archdeacon performed 3 sets of 100 litanies, Господи помилуй, Lord have mercy. The Metropolitan then led the procession onto Cathedral Square and made his way to a spot between the Palace Church and the necropolis where chairs had been placed for him and the Tsar. The Tsar emerged onto the porch of the Palace Church, and after walking onto the square, he bowed to the Gospels and the icons, received the blessing of the Metropolitan, and then took his own place for the ceremony to begin. It was called Leta Provozhenia, which means valediction of the year, welcoming the new year. The very term, however, suggests a special importance placed on bidding farewell to the year completed just as the new year was ushered in, the end of one implying the beginning of the next. A change of state that is symbolized by 2 antiphonal choirs and 2 gospel books. They don't just use 1 gospel book, but 2. So this notion of beginning and end is very important. 2 analogia, or lecterns, like this, had been set up to hold each gospel book. And a 3rd one held the icon of Simeon the Stylite, whose feast day is September 1st. 3 psalms were read. 73, which asks redemption for the chosen people. Psalm 2, which states that fear of the Lord will guarantee the heritage of the chosen people. And 64, which underscores the covenant between God and his chosen people, and which actually serves as a source for some of the inscriptions that we just saw. We don't have to read all of this, but just note that certain parts of it come into the inscriptions. Praise is due to thee, O God in Sion, and unto thee shall the vow be performed. Blessed is the man whom thou choosest, and causest to approach unto thee, that he may dwell in thy courts. He shall be satisfied with the goodness of thy house, even of thy holy temple. And then if we move down, thou visitest the earth, and waterest it. Thou greatly enrichest it with the river of God, which is full of water. Thou crownest the year with thy goodness. Remember, crown the year with thy goodness. That was one of the inscriptions that we read. At this point, the Metropolitan signs with the cross 3 times to the east, the south, the west, and the north. And then the selected passages from the Old Testament are read, namely Isaiah 61, verses 1 through 9. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good tidings to the afflicted. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, proclaim liberty to the captives, and an opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. This is another of the inscriptions that's on the ceiling. After a brief reading from Paul's epistle to Timothy, with prayers and thanksgivings for all kings and those in high positions, the gospel is read. The passage from Luke 4 describes Christ's return to the synagogue in Nazareth, where he stood up to read the very passage from Isaiah, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. In other words, I, Christ, am anointed in this, the year of the Lord's favor. So what is unusual is that the same passage is read twice, line for line, first by the Metropolitan, then by the Archdeacon from each of the Gospel books. This doubling would appear to emphasize the identification of end and beginning, the ending of one year, the beginning of the next. The year to come, from the beginning to end, is the year of the Lord's favor. After plunging the cross into holy water, the Metropolitan launches the new year by signing to the 4 corners of the earth. Wishing the Tsar many long years, he sprinkles him with holy water, followed by the boyars and all the people gathered, just as he does in the Epiphany ritual on January 6th. The Tsar bows to the icons and returns to the palace church for the Eucharist. Now this metaphor of the New Year's service, bidding farewell to the old while anticipating the new, identifying beginning and ending, was an ideal expression of a new age. A valedictory to the promise of the Old Testament, to the law of Moses, and the victories of Joshua was inextricably linked to the Russian embrace of the New Testament, grace, zakon, and order, kanyets, nachala. The throne room counterpart to the vestibule's Joshua narrative, interestingly, is not a history of Christ's early life. It's not about his incarnation, his birth, his baptism, and death that we might expect to see in an Orthodox church, but rather it's narrative sequences from Russian history, from the lives of Saint Volodymyr and Volodymyr Monomach. And if we look at that, two narratives here, V1, 2, 3, that's Saint Volodymyr, leading over here to V4, and then VM, Volodymyr Monomach, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, leading back to 7. So they are the counterparts of the Joshua narrative in the vestibule. And what's important is that the Monomach, number 7, is when he receives the regalia sent by the emperor of Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor, that establishes that connection between Byzantium and Rus. Let's look in more detail at the walls of the throne room. Again, southwest, northeast. Let's start with the south. Here we're looking right at the Tsar, at his throne, in his throne, on his throne, and we see the fourth panel regarding Saint Vladimir, where he's tossing over the pagan gods into the river, and we then continue around, and this is already scenes from the life of Volodymyr Monomach and his victorious encounters with the Byzantines. The north wall, here he is receiving the crown and actually being crowned here. And this is exactly the wall that faces the Tsar sitting on his throne. Moving around then to the east wall, we see the beginnings of the life of Saint Volodymyr, this important choice of the Christian faith, and finally, him being baptized. That is the image of Volodymyr that is directly adjacent to the Tsar's throne. Therefore, we would assume it has to be rather important. Then the directionality, if we look at the way that that appears in the scheme, we can see that we have this directionality going around the room as we saw before, but then this image with him crowned as king, of course, immediately then comes back to the Tsar sitting on the throne here. That is the way in which this room differs from the first. Then in the pendentives, instead of having Old Testament kings, what do we have? We have important grand princes of Rus, which I've given abbreviations to. So here is Vladimir himself, and then Boris, Andrei Bogolyubsky, Mikhail Tverskoy, Michael of Tver, Alexander Nevsky, Ivan III, who is the grandfather of Ivan the Terrible, and Vasily III, who is the father of Ivan the Terrible. And then that line will lead also directly back to the Tsar. So you're already getting different directions that are all converging on the throne itself. So unlike the vestibule vault program, the throne room counterpart has no single directionality. The Gideon narrative over the east wall, labeled G here, G 1, 2, 3, 4, you see, proceeds out from the throne. This is the narrative in which the Jews overcome 7 years of Midianite domination, followed by 40 years of peace. The two-paneled rendering of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, which is black number 4, and the thematically connected tales of King Hezekiah and Emperor Anastasius, 5, lead out again towards this north wall. So like the pendentive figures, they embrace the entrance to the throne room. The remaining vault frescoes are connected not by chronological narrative, but by theme, the theme of choice, limited selection, an emphasis on those rare individuals who recognize and understand wisdom and the truth. The royal throne is viewed against two panels. Important to really emphasize this, because again, this is a conscious choice. So here we see the throne room looking at the east wall, and once again I want to point out and emphasize that it is Vladimir's baptism that is the most adjacent image to the throne. Why is that important here? Remember that Ivan himself was crowned Tsar on the first Sunday following Epiphany, the Orthodox celebration of the baptism of Christ. Vladimir's baptism marks the inauguration of the Christian history of Rus. So it is that image that the Tsar wants to be most closely identified with. Ivan's royal baptism marks the beginning now of a new age in that history of redemption. On the south wall, behind the throne, there is a break in the narrative, and under the inscription, "The house of the Lord God is a holy sanctuary," we see an enthroned mother of God with child sanctifying the Tsar beneath. Here's the mother and child right over the throne itself. There are then three standing figures that complete the scene: St. Peter, David, and Solomon right here with inscriptions. And they, of course, are repeating the verse that we saw earlier. Wisdom hath builded her house. The inspiration for the wisdom iconography that dominates the room from above. And if we look above, again to that ceiling, and just twist it 90 degrees, you will see that that very image of wisdom feeding those who want what she has to offer is represented right in that area near where the Tsar sits. Now, the basic components of the iconography of wisdom are present and known in Rus from as early as the 1363 frescoes from Volatova near Novgorod. Wisdom is seated on a throne with a golden cup in the left hand, a rod or staff in the right. Servants dispense wisdom to those who seek it, pouring out wine or preparing meat from slaughtered calves. The enthroned Mother of God with the child, John, Damascene, and Solomon complete the image. And if we look at a very famous icon of wisdom and give you a detail of it, you can see that there she is seated on her throne with a golden cup in one hand and a rod in the other. And she is customarily represented in a female form as Sophia, wisdom, as seen in this, as I say, in this well-known Novgorod icon of the mid-16th century. But in the Golden Hall, divine wisdom is instead depicted as Christ Emmanuel, wearing a seven-pointed crown, Christ who has existed before all ages and who himself may be represented as a young child with a mature visage, or as the Ancient of Days that we see here. This impressive vision of, or image of wisdom, Jesus Christ, is accompanied by a cosmography with multiple circles containing enthroned personifications of the seasons, the winds. All of that is going on here. Angels with trumpets, a reclining woman as the earth, looking out at the sun, with creatures of the sea below, a cart pulled by an oxen carrying a woman holding the moon, which is located right here. A flaming chariot pulled by horses with an angel holding the sun. The entire event held aloft by four angels, which is right up here. Directly beneath Christ are gates leading to heaven and hell, which are located right here. And four personifications of vices and virtues are depicted on either side of the gates. Among the elements of hell is the seven-headed beast from Revelation. And there are other as yet unciphered inscriptions which seem to combine characters from Cyrillic and Glagolitic alphabets, and they appeared in some of the open scrolls and books. One last image is important to keep in mind. No one makes much of it, but I think it's important. Namely, that if we look at the ceiling fresco, and we note that the throne is located right down here, that what is the image that is directly above the Tsar? It's this image right here. And what is that image? These are the seven churches of Revelation. These are the seven churches that loom up over the Tsar and contain such passages as, "Thus saith the first and the last, which was dead and which is alive. Thus saith the Son of God, who hath his eyes unto like a flame of fire." And an image of Solomon rises above the gables of the seven churches and carries a scroll which reads, "Wisdom hath builded her house." And then an inscription beneath Solomon based on the beginning of the book of Revelation, and a message to the seven churches, "Grace be unto you and peace from God, which is, which was, and which is to come, and from the seven spirits which are before his throne." So if the linearity of Russian history leads us with all of these directions right to the throne, then it is from the throne that a direct connection is made with the ceiling fresco that looms right above it, articulated by the image of 6. And notice that it's actually divided into 6 parts. And those of you who care about symbolism will understand that the geometry of 6, representing the expectation of the first coming of Christ to Jerusalem, first captured by David, whose emblem is the 6-pointed star. The throne room is partitioned by the eschatological number of 8, which represents the expectation of the second coming and the realization of the New Jerusalem. This reading is confirmed by recalling that the Ancient of Days, described by Ushakov, wears a crown with 7 points. In fact, both Sophia, the Divine Wisdom, and the Ancient of Days, depicted on icons of the Last Judgment, typically have not a round halo, as one might expect, but rather 2 square or diamond-shaped halos that are offset by 45 degrees. So if we actually look at an icon of the Last Judgment, we can see that this image of God Sabaoth, or the Ancient of Days, has an 8-pointed star behind him as a halo. And if we look more closely at an 18th century image, here you can see it more clearly, that this is 8-pointed. And the reason why Ushakov describes it as 7 points is, of course, that the 8th point is located right here behind his head, so you can't see it. All you see is the 7. This, then, is the Redeemer, just described in Daniel's vision. Daniel, book 7, 9 and 10. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the one that was Ancient of Days took his seat. His raiment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came forth from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The courts sat in judgment, and the books were opened. So it's within this context of final redemption at the Last Judgment that Ivan and his advisors have chosen to view their new age. The cosmic year of the Lord's favor, in which he was anointed, is his own reign, beginning and end. The 16th, as opposed to 17th century inscription, reads not with the imperative, crown the year, blagoslavi, with thy goodness, but with the atemporal, thou crownest the year, blagoslavishi, with goodness. Ivan's reign is to be seen as the link between the world that was and the world that is to be beyond time, a millennial kingdom. In the throne room, the historical forces of preordination have seen the pagan Vladimir choose the right religion, and the Byzantines choose Vladimir Monomach to inherit the legacy of the old and new Rome. The line leads to Ivan IV, himself crowned by Metropolitan Makary, with the words, "Know that it is from God that your authority has been given, and your power from the Most High. The Lord God has selected you in his stead on earth, and having raised you up, has placed you on his throne. Вас, Бог, Господь Бог в себе место избра на земли, и на свой престол вознес посади." Above the Tsar, leading out from the throne, God selects Gideon to lead the Israelites who were victorious over the Midianites. The various parables and stories refer to the work of providence and choice. The wise will choose the correct path, Balaam and Josaphat. A seed falling in the right place will bear fruit. Many are called, few are chosen. The years of the good king, Hezekiah, are extended. Those of the bad king, Anastasius, reduced. Dominating the room from above in the palace, in the place in a church typically reserved for Christ, Pantocrator, Christ as divine wisdom, as final judge, controls all of the elements of nature, the seasons, the winds, the sun and the moon, the earth and the sea. And as wisdom, he offers up a cosmic Eucharist of dispensed wisdom, symbolically represented as wine and slaughtered calf. The resultant encounter with the timeless is to be found in the broad path or the narrow path, leading to heaven or to hell, choice of vice or virtue. And so the 7 angels in churches over the Tsar's throne are indicative of the millennium at hand. And it is this vision of Moscow's destiny that the Tsar embodies as he encounters his subjects in the Golden Hall throne room. And all I can say is, 감사합니다.